Welcome to the Shudder. I've got a very interesting collection of stories from the Northeast. 2 are from Maine, and 1 is from New Jersey. I'll be putting these stories together by region because there's just not enough to do state by state and have a production with any length to it. So I want to thank everybody who submitted a story. I'll be getting to them and recording them very soon. If you have a story you'd like me to tell, I'd be happy to put it out here for you. My email is in the description. Okay, shoo that cat away from that rocking chair and settle in. When I was 13 years old, I was on holiday with my parents in Bedford, Maine. It was a sunny, chilly day in April. I told my parents I was going for a walk along an estuary leading out to the ocean. When I came close to the water, I saw a winding stream with sand banks rising 5 feet in front of me. As I climbed up the bank to look at the water, I saw a figure floating on its back coming in with the tide. I'd say we spotted each other at about the same time, so I just stepped up into the dune from one side. It was 4 or 5 steps, and I was on top of the dune. I looked down at the water, and there he was, right in front of me. I can easily think about that moment, and I had no idea what I was looking at. I could see him so clearly, even his hair as it swirled around his body. Mind you, at this time in my life, I had never heard of Yetis or Bigfoot. This figure had the shape of a man with grayish hair and a hairless, pinkish to reddish face with no hair on it. This creature had no breast that I could see. Only while reading about Bigfoot recently did I notice that occasionally a whitish gray one appears, so I got excited and had to write about it. The rest of his body had hair which moved as the water washed around him. He was on his back and floating in head first. He was no more than 15 feet away from me. He didn't move one bit as I gazed at him. His arms were to his side, and he lay motionless, but the incoming water was moving him along this creek pretty fast. His body was barely awash, meaning he was floating on top of the water with about half an inch covering his body. His nose, eyes, and mouth were out of the water. His facial skin looked wrinkly. Not a lot, but he had mostly deep wrinkles on his face. Another thing about his face is that it was bare, not even a whisker. One more thing, the amount of his facial reddishness was like a sunburnt man. He showed no facial expression, only his eyes moved over to me, and that was a little scary, but I stood there and stared back at him. I don't think I shared any expression. The hair was about 6 to 8 inches long and loosely floated around his body. It looked like it was the consistency or thickness of a golden retriever, not thick and matted like other Bigfoot reports I've read. I did notice his knees, hairy, slightly bent up, and still just below the water. While I was watching him, I saw no effort to move his hands or arms. He easily drifted in without any body, arm, or hand movement that I noticed. I will never forget how I felt during the brief time that I saw him. It was a deep soul connection that overcame me. I felt peaceful and calm the whole time. I want to go back to where I saw him someday in hopes of connecting with him or his children. I thought it would be hard for me to walk down the little dune and follow him, and I don't think I would have since the dune led into the water and I would have gotten wet. Besides, I was so startled I could only look at him. Having never heard of these creatures, I ran through my mind every creature I'd ever seen, and this didn't exist in my library of known animals. I ran back to my parents, who were in a house along the beach, and excitedly told them what I had seen. They didn't pay much attention to me and thought I had seen a seal or walrus or some other sea animal. I never thought much about it and kind of forgot about it for many years. Later, I began to read and hear about Bigfoot, but never put what I saw together with them. The reason was that all reports I have read, these creatures were never grayish white, and they were very tall. This guy was about 6 feet in length, no more. But finally, about 10 years ago, I realized this might have been a Yeti. What else could it be? I feel a deep connection to the Bigfoot, and my experience will always be with me. My friend and I, a zoology student, decided to spend a part of our vacation time negotiating the Bemis Valley Trail. It's a tough climb for those of us not used to frequent alpine climbs, roughly a 12 to 15 mile loop through the rugged country. The four peaks of Bemis are breathtakingly beautiful in autumn. We took a side trail to Mooselook-Maguntic Lake and arrived in time to watch the sun going down. We tacked down a two-man tent, and as we talked about turning in early, exhausted from the day's hike, we heard a movement, then saw a huge man-shaped shadow approaching the water's edge of the lake. I asked Jim who he thought that was. We hadn't seen any other hikers around, and this guy was huge. We stared briefly, then he grabbed my hand. "Get in the tent," he said. "Why? What is that?" He shushed me to be very quiet, and we watched, being very still. The dark figure waded into the water and stood very still for the longest time. Then suddenly, like a shot, it took a header with its arms down by its sides, head first into the lake. It was a huge splash. The ripples faded along with the last rays of daylight, and yet we kept staring into the darkening lake with wonder. How truly bizarre. I'm not used to seeing anything like that. I'm a city girl. Jim, however, was raised in the country, is nature savvy, and seemed floored at what we just witnessed. I asked him if that could have been a big bear. His answer was a resounding no. That was no bear. It was no moose. It was the biggest man I've ever seen, or it was a Bigfoot. It was too dark to see details. I laughed and said, "There's no such thing. I read about that man out in the west somewhere that made that story up." But Jim insisted they do exist, and we had just seen one dive into the lake. He must be right, because who would dive into that black as pitch lake at night? If it did surface, we never did see it. He got chills and started to shiver. He went quiet for a while, then said, "I wonder if you realize how rare what we just saw is." I didn't know what to say, but in my mind I thought, he really thinks that thing was a Bigfoot. He continued to shiver from exhaustion and probably excitement. As tired as we were that night, we didn't sleep much until almost dawn. Jim seemed awed by it. I didn't know what to think. We slept in until almost noon Sunday. We went down to the water's edge where this thing was last seen. There was one clear half of a bare footprint in the mud, pointing toward the water. The heel to the little toe showed, and Jim figured it to be about 15 inches long at that point, but longer at the big toe's end, that part now lost in the muck and mire. The heel width was about 6 inches, but we had nothing to measure accurately with but our hands and a flashlight. Later, I measured the span of my hand, and I think the heel was 6 inches wide. Neither of us could be certain about the length, since the big toe and second and third toes were underwater and muddied. The heel depth was at least 3.5 inches deep. Jim was very quiet and reflective on the trek home and preoccupied. During the drive, he told me nobody would ever believe us, and we ought to stay still about the whole incident. That was a few weeks ago. I've been searching the internet for information on Bigfoot and found your site. It's all quite interesting. I have mixed feelings. I thought Bigfoot was a myth. Now, I'm not sure, and I can tell you my friend is convinced they exist, but he'll never talk about it for employment reasons. Long story. What do you think? Did we see a Bigfoot? You know, I wasn't there. I can't tell you what you saw, but according to the information, this guy's a zoologist. And I just kind of do the math, process of elimination. What did it look like, and what else could it have been? My grandfather worked from the late 50s to the early 70s as a landscaper on the Duke Estate in Somerset, New Jersey. When he told this story to my sister and me, he was foggy when giving the exact dates, but he was still very sharp and explained it with incredible detail. My grandfather's job was to manicure and care for the lawns in the north section of the property and other various duties. He said that in the summer of 1972, he was told by the head groundskeeper that he would be working overtime and that he was needed because a shipment was being delivered from Wisconsin. They needed about 8 men to unload a crate and to bring it to the garden area. That night, the truck arrived and it was getting late. The men who were asked to stay for overtime were eager to get this thing done and over with and be on their way. When the truck pulled up, my grandfather said that the crate was about 8 feet tall and 5 feet wide. When he asked what was inside it, the man in charge said they were exotic trees. What happened next was enough to make half of the team get up and walk off the job and not care about the consequences. When the men started pushing the crate off the flatbed truck, a blood-curdling scream was unleashed from within the box. All of the men let go of their grip and the crate fell to the floor. As everyone jumped back, realizing that this was anything but a tree, the head keeper did all he could to save the contents' real identity and said there was a black bear inside it. While the men were regaining their composure, most of the help walked off the job. They said they didn't want to get hurt or mauled dealing with a wild animal without the proper safety equipment, so off they went, including my grandfather. Only 2 men stayed to finish what they were asked. This is what was told to my grandfather. The 2 remaining men managed to get the load onto a dolly and then drag it into the garden compound. While guiding the crate down the main path, balance was lost and the crate came off the wheels. The crate hit hard enough to crack the side of it and loosen the side panel, which fell off and exposed the contents. What the 2 remaining men witnessed that night was enough to make them seek employment elsewhere. What I'm telling you is how it was told to me. Inside the crate sat a creature that had the shape of a man, but was definitely not a man. They couldn't give a height measurement since the creature was in a sitting position, but they said it was huge. It had the shape of a man with a very large frame, only it was covered with black hair. The creature was strapped down and had shackles on its legs, feet, and arms. The face didn't look like a man, but it had some human features. The workers said it looked more like a monkey or gorilla. The hair was extremely long and dirty. At one point, one of the men said they thought that this thing was trying to speak or communicate with words, but all it did was keep on drooling. They were under the impression that this creature was heavily sedated because it couldn't keep its head up straight. A couple of inches away from the creature's head was an empty water bottle nailed to the wall. On the other side of the creature was an IV stand connected to the wall and stuck to its arm. It might have been used to feed this creature during transport. One of the oddest parts of this story was that my grandfather was told that this creature was sitting in a rocking chair. I could never understand this. After thinking about it, though, I think it was maybe to prevent this thing from getting cramps during the move. They also said that the odor was overpowering and enough to make anyone pass out. The combined smell of urine, waste, and body odor was rank. My grandfather stuck by the story until the very end. About 2 weeks before he passed away, my sister reminded me to bring it up again and confront him, which I did. There was no need to go over the story again because we both knew how it went. I just asked him, "Papa, remember the crate you had to move in Jersey?" He just looked at me, smiled, and said, "Of course." I said, "Did you embellish at all?" He said, "No, there was no reason to. It happened the way I said it happened." I said, "Because now would be the time to tell me." He looked at me and said, "You want to know if I embellished the story? The truth is that I'm guilty of the opposite. There was so much that I left out. The story was just the beginning. Remember something. I worked there for 2 more years after that. There are things that a young mind should not hear." I said, "But I'm not a child anymore. I'm sure I can handle what it is that you have to say." Grandfather said, "Tomorrow I will finish the story. Come back tomorrow." But there was no tomorrow. Grandfather passed away at 2 a.m. that morning in a New York hospital. Wow, what a shame. It was a great story though. I had read it a while back, and when I came across it, again, I just knew I had to tell it. There are tons of implications in the whole thing. But hey, it is what it is. I hope you enjoyed those accounts from the Northeast. If you did, give them a like and a share. And if you subscribe, make sure you hit that notification bell so you can join me here next time for the Shudder.